We begin this news hour in Ukraine, where the sound of explosions and sirens have once again filled the air, and authorities say large-scale Russian attacks have left at least 11 people dead. A combination of rocket and drone strikes destroyed several residential buildings and energy infrastructure across 11 regions. Residential areas of Kyiv were also hit. In what was a sustained and wide-ranging attack, the head of the Ukrainian army said Moscow launched 55 air and sea-based missiles. 47 of them were reportedly shot down, including 20 around Kyiv. Well, the latest wave of Russian strikes come as Ukraine's president thanked Western leaders for sending tanks to support the fight against Moscow, but said they needed them to be delivered quickly. In his nightly address, Volodymyr Zelensky also urged the West to send long-range missiles and fighter jets. His comments came after the US and Germany announced they would send the highly sought-after military hardware to Ukraine. President Biden confirmed the US would be sending 31 Abrams tanks. Germany earlier announced it would provide 14 of its most advanced tank, the Leopard 2. Berlin will also allow other European countries to deliver the German-made combat vehicles from their own stocks. The Kremlin has dismissed the deliveries as disastrous and costly, and that the tanks would go up in flames. Ukraine's commanders say they will need 300 Western tanks to make a difference on the battlefield.
The key now is speed and volume. The speed of training of our military. The speed of supplying tanks to Ukraine. The volume of tank support. We have to form such a tank fist, such a fist of freedom, after hits of which tyranny will not rise again. We can do it together. I spoke today with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. We have also to open the supply of long-range missiles for Ukraine. It is important that we expand our cooperation in artillery, and we have to reach the supply of us. The more defense support our heroes at the front receive from the world, the sooner Russia's aggression will end and the more reliable the security guarantees for Ukraine and all our partners will be after the war. The terrorist state must lose. People's right to life must be protected. And so it will be.
President Zelensky, well, the German defense minister said he thought the Leopard 2 tanks would be delivered to Ukraine by the end of March. He was speaking whilst visiting troops at an army base in East Germany.
To Ukraine in time?
Of course we will.
How long will it take to get there?
At the end of the first quarter of the year. And that's what we are going to do.
How many months? 2, 3, 4?
I just said at the end of March, I think.
Is that in time because Ukrainians expect a Russian offensive to be imminent?
All I know is that it is in time.
And will there be enough there to repel the Russian attack, do you think?
We'll see about that later.
What are you here for today?
To see the troops and to get a picture of what's going on here. What the soldiers are learning, what they are doing, to learn the Puma and everything else.
What message do you think sending the Leopards to Ukraine sends to Vladimir Putin?
That German doesn't relent, and that we stand with Ukraine.
And did the hesitation, was that time lost, do you think?
We were negotiating.
And what damage was done to Germany's reputation?
Well, Arise chief correspondent John Cookson has been monitoring all those developments, and he joins me now from London. Great to see you, John. So a reminder today then that despite Western support, Russian forces are continuing to try to grind down Ukraine. Bring us up to date with what's been happening there today.
Well, earlier you summarised the attack that happened overnight and this morning, Charles. As you said, 55 rockets. The Ukrainians claim that Russian rockets and drones the Russians fired at various targets in Ukraine. The Ukrainians claiming they shot 47 of them down. But there has been substantial damage and at least 11 people dead, 3 of them down south in Zaporizhzhia. Of course, This is an ongoing campaign by the Russians that really began last October in earnest. This kind of blitz that happens overnight in the morning on infrastructure in Ukraine, and this is the best that the Russians can do whilst they can't make big gains on the battlefield. Although there are reports tonight that they've taken territory in the Donbass region, but this blitz that the Russians can perform almost at will in Ukraine until Ukraine gets effective defense systems in place. The Russians will continue to do this, and it not only knocks out infrastructure and causes blackouts and cuts of electricity supplies to hospitals and to railways and all the infrastructure of life in Ukraine. It also impacts on the morale of the people. And earlier today on Arise News, we were showing images of people taking shelter in subway stations in Kiev. And when I was there back in March, they were doing the same thing. So it's almost a year now that the poor Ukrainian people have had to suffer this kind of intimidation and physical attack from Russia. And it must surely impact on the Ukrainian people, although their spirit, as I found when I was there, is quite extraordinary, Charles.
And John, we heard President Zelensky there talking in reaction to the decision to send the Leopard tanks and the Abrams from America, talking about a freedom force that would ensure that tyranny would never rise up again. I mean, that's the rhetoric at least. But what's the military reality in your assessment?
Well, the military reality is that these tanks are not going to arrive in a big rush. We already heard from Pistorius there that it will be at least before the end of March that the Leopard, 14 Leopard tanks from Germany will arrive. The American ones, as we were discussing last night, it could be up to a year, Charles, before the Abrams tanks are there and the Ukrainians are trained properly on how to use them. The British tanks will arrive in due course. But tanks, as we said before, will not win the war for Zelensky. They're part of an ongoing campaign, including other armaments like HIMARS rockets that can take out Russian tanks. And don't underestimate the Tu-90 Russian tanks, Charles. They before all this conflict began, they were rated as some of the best tanks in the world. Although military experts say that once all the tanks are in place and the Russians have their Tu-75 and their Tu-90s against the Leopards and other tanks from Western countries, it will be like two boxers fighting in a ring, Charles. And one boxer can throw a punch, these are the Russians, but they're very great difficulty moving, dipping and diving. In other words, the Russian tanks are not extremely maneuverable as the Western tanks are. So you've got the other boxer, namely Ukraine, backed by Ukrainian tanks, able to be nimble in the ring and, to extend the metaphor, able possibly to deliver the knockout blow and push through Russian defenses and into Crimea. But look, this is all theory. We don't know how things are going to develop in the next week or months, except to know that the Russians and the Ukrainians are preparing for a big new offensive. Charles.
Well, that's a very interesting, very informative assessment there, John. And public opinion in Germany seeming to suggest that sending tanks is the wrong decision and is simply increasing the military option when negotiation should be the way forward. Does that suggest that many people in Germany are worried about the risks rising in the wrong direction?
It's only some Germans, Charles, and if you look at the opinion polls, it's not the majority. The majority seem to think that the Scholz decision was the right one for now. But for many Germans, this is a wrong decision, sending German tanks to Ukraine to frankly kill Russians. Germans, remember, in 2 world wars, killed millions of Russians, and it sticks in the craw of many older Germans who think that this is not Germany's role in Europe to support Ukraine in this way against Russia. And many Germans, of course, Germany was divided in two parts until relatively recently, West and East Germany. And Scholz himself was an avowed Marxist in his early years in politics, and used to visit East Germany a lot and have contact with Moscow. So, you know, the historic links are there, and this is what troubles many Germans, that they don't like the idea of being behind or supporting sending offensive weapons to kill Russians.
John, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. John Cookson, Arise chief correspondent there. And John, do stay with us, because I'd like to get your assessment of the story that's coming up after the break. You're watching Arise News Hour. Still ahead, the judge investigating the 2020 Beirut port explosion has been summoned by Lebanon's top prosecutor. Welcome back to Arise News Hour. I'm Charles Aniagulu in Abuja. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading to Israel next week to try to end escalating violence after 9 Palestinians were killed in an Israeli raid on a crowded refugee camp in the West Bank city of Jenin, bringing the number of Palestinians killed by Israeli forces so far this year to 29. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has declared 3 days of national mourning after this morning's attack, which the Palestinians are saying was a massacre, with more than 20 people injured, some of them critically. Long-standing tensions between Israel and the Palestinians have dramatically increased in the past few weeks since Benjamin Netanyahu returned to power, leading Israel's most right-wing government in history. It's reported to be planning to build 18,000 more homes for Israeli settlers in the West Bank in the coming months, in defiance of UN resolutions.
The massacre that the Israeli occupation army committed today morning in Jenin city confirms the racist, fascist and criminal right-wing occupation, Israeli, government. This aggression, in addition to the continued violations at Al-Aqsa Mosque and of the rights of the Palestinians in Israel, show that this government insists on escalating the situation. The resistance will always be ready to defend its people everywhere. This is an ongoing and escalating revolution until the occupation is kicked out of the entire Palestinian land.
There is a huge number of injuries. We have never seen such an invasion before. There is damage and injuries.
I want to congratulate the anti-terrorism forces, the Israeli army, the Shin Bet, who last night fulfilled a successful operation. And we give support to our combat soldiers in the war against the terrorists, against the militants. Every policeman, every combat soldier, every soldier should know that they have full support from Israel's government, from the Ministry of National Security and from the Chief of Police.
And that's the Israeli Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and before him the head of the Red Crescent, Mahmoud al-Sadi, and also a Hamas spokesperson, Hazim Qasim. Well, let's once again speak with our chief correspondent, John Cookson, who covered the Middle East extensively and who's been monitoring these developments from London. Thank you for staying with us, John. What's the latest that you're hearing from Jenin? I understand Israeli forces have now pulled out.
They have. They pulled out this morning, in fact. The raid began at about 3:40 a.m. There are two versions of the story, as there always are in this part of the world. The Israelis say that Jenin is a hotbed for terrorism, and they moved in to find terrorists who were planning a major attack in Israel. That's their version of the story. The Palestinians say that the Israeli special forces moved in commercial vehicles and with bulldozers. They were terrified. They thought that they were going to be murdered and their homes destroyed, and inevitably shooting began, and which has left at least 9 people dead, including a 60-year-old woman. Adding to the death toll this January alone, as you already said, Charles, of 29. I point out that 5 of those are children. And how depressing this cycle of violence is. I have been working in the Middle East for a long time now, and those sound bites that we heard a short time ago, we've heard them over and over and over again, and there just seems to be no resolution to this conflict. Anthony Blinken heading to the region. It's his 4th visit to Jerusalem since taking office, but he's been there many times before, even during the Obama administration. And, you know, there is no peace process underway in this part of the world at the moment. Back in the day, you know, during the Intifada periods and beyond, there was these talks about peace, but there's absolutely nothing happening at the moment, Charles. And, you know, there have been treaties and UN resolutions, but nothing seems to be able to stop the violence in the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. So tonight, things are pretty tense. There have been demonstrations across the West Bank, including in Ramallah at the university there, thousands of students taking to the streets in protest. Fatah, the political organization, called a general strike. We've heard about the period of mourning, and perhaps more crucially, the Palestinians in the West Bank have cut their security ties with Israel. So none of this is good news, and because there is, as you say, a right-wing regime running Israel at the moment, these events and killings and dreadful things happening in that part of the world, it's frankly going to just continue, I'm afraid.
And John, as I mentioned at the outset, I mean, you covered the Middle East extensively. I mean, Palestinian territories and Israel. And of course, you also reported extensively for Arise News from Ukraine. I wonder whether you see any parallels between the two places. The outlook that you think, you know, might be we might see in consequence to those two sort of conflicts.
Yeah, and ironic, isn't it, Charles, that whilst the world is watching Russia, Ukraine, all this is going on in the Middle East, whereas you know, in normal times with no war in Eastern Europe, the world will perhaps be focusing more on the Middle East. Well, I mean, it's all about territory when it boils down to it. Putin believes that Ukraine should be part of Russia, as indeed he has the same view about Belarus, but there's a puppet government there, so he's happy for the time being. He sees taking the south of the Ukraine as a springboard to taking the rest of the country and reuniting, as he would see, Ukraine with Russia. Ukraine was made a separate country by Lenin back in 1922, and it's always been the Wild West ever since, in the decades that followed, just by its geographical position in the world. And Ukraine is an old Russian word for being on the edge, Charles, and like many countries in the world that are on the edge or between two great empires, as it were, like, for example, Iraq, there will always, it seems, be conflict there. So you've got that situation with Russia, Ukraine, Russia trying to regain what it sees as Russian territory. And of course, the Palestinian-Israel issue is all about territory, is it not, since Israel was created back in 1948, and the Palestinian territories were at the time under British rule, and even Jenin then was, the Brits would say, was a hotbed of militancy as people want to reclaim their land. The Palestinians say that Israel is occupying Palestinian lands, and you know, the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, then was a bit of a turning point. It really ratcheted up tensions and conflict, because Israel sees so much territory there that the Palestinians claim is theirs. And even tonight, today, tomorrow, the Israeli settlers will be building new homes on what the Palestinians rightly claim is their land, and so it goes on. So it is about territory. You can draw parallels between Israel and the Palestinians and Russia and Ukraine, and that's at the very heart of the conflict: is who owns what. And sadly, 100,000 people have died on either side in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, and I can't think how many people have died in the Middle East as a result of the Israel-Palestinian conflict.
John, thanks very much indeed. A depressing scenario in both cases, but we appreciate you giving us the benefit of your experience. John Cookson is Arise chief correspondent, and he was talking to me there from London.